I'm Alan Sharland, and I'm Director of CAOS Conflict Management, which is a company that I set up 6 years ago now. And our aim is to promote mindful communication and growth through conflict. Prior to setting up CAOS, I was Director of a community mediation service in West London, and that operated for 11 years. But then the financial crisis led to cutting in a lot of local authority services. That's what then led me into setting up CAOS. Conflict for me is, I have two answers to that. One is a quote, and one is the answer or the kind of conventional understanding we use at CAOS. So the quote is that conflict is the beginning of consciousness. So that was said by a woman called Mary Esther Harding, who was an associate of Carl Jung. I really like that because it's about saying that for me, it's saying that conflict is an opportunity to wake up, to become aware of something. It's not falling into the trap of saying conflict is only bad. For me, it's the responses to conflict which are bad or good, constructive or destructive. The conflict just is, it just happens. Conflict is an inevitable part of life, arising from difference. I don't really have any terrible examples. The main one that I can think of was actually just before I set up the community mediation service that I mentioned, where I was in a situation kind of temporarily working for a local authority. And I seemed to have a different line manager depending on which day of the week it was. And I never quite knew who I was working with. I could kind of be asked to write a report by one person, and it would be another person who'd take it away and read it, and then I'd end up reporting to them, and I never knew from one day to the next who my line manager was, which in a way became quite frustrating. But I think what I'm pleased about was that it didn't become a serious issue. I was able to address it with the managers concerned, even though it was a kind of subordinate dealing with a manager kind of situation. It was resolved from my side because I was able to tell them about it and explain it, and the person who was perhaps the more common line manager, shall we say, the one who I saw most, understood the difficulty that I had and then kind of did something about it. Whether it would have changed the practices across that particular local authority, I doubt. Because it kind of worked out okay, I don't know I would do much differently. I might have tried to address it a bit earlier. What I'm pleased about was that it was dealt with in a way which wasn't cheeky subordinate telling the managers they're not doing their job properly kind of thing. It was listened to. The thing about conflict being bad, I understand why people can often say that kind of thing, because they see the response to conflict as the conflict. We see the bad outcome of conflict when there's been a destructive response to it. So that's what we then say, oh, that's the conflict. But the conflict just happened. Because sometimes when it's dealt with in a bad way or an ineffective way, a destructive way, people can sometimes start to say conflict itself is bad. But I don't think it can ever be avoided. If I, say, have a difficulty with someone and I think I'm going to have an argument with them, or I have a difficulty with a particular situation and I keep avoiding it, I might think, okay, that's dealt with the conflict, but I now have to live my life worrying about where this other person is. So it hasn't resolved it at all. It's just a different way of destructively responding to it. The idea of avoiding conflict is not something we can ever do. I see conflict as being a bit like kind of water. It'll always find its way through one way or another. And even though it might feel safer to avoid it sometimes, as I say, if we avoid it too often, we've got so many things we have to avoid in life, we may as well just stay trapped at home. Yeah, drama's really useful, I think, for conflict management training, because it's not the kind of thing that you can get across to people just by a lecture. I think people have to experience and be able to have a chance to reflect on an experience. And I think if people can be involved in things like a role play or some other kind of dramatic presentation of a conflict, then it means that they're able to, I would say it's always got to be experiential training with conflict resolution and conflict management training. You can learn lots of theories, but at the end of the day, the emotional side of things, the kind of the consideration and the reflection of what it is we're feeling inside when we've got a conflict with someone or with a situation or within ourselves. I don't think you can get that across with a lecture. If I can kind of have a conversation with someone in a kind of a role play situation or maybe some other kind of representation of a problem, I've got to stop and think, well, how would I feel in this? Or maybe I can't even stop and think, I've got to feel it in the moment of doing it. So I do see role play and other uses of drama in training people with conflict resolution to be really important and really useful. I don't think I've ever found anybody impossible to work with doing conflict management training. Obviously, for some people it's quite challenging what it is that can be presented, but in a way I'm glad. It's important that anything that we're doing is going to cause people to be challenged and therefore perhaps be resistant initially to what is presented. And I think if there wasn't that, it would be quite boring for them. I think it's got to be a transformational thing. But I've never found anybody impossible. I think if I started thinking somebody was impossible to work with, I think I'd have to start looking at what I'm doing that means that they're so resistant that they're being, in my view, impossible. Because I think that's got to mean that I'm presenting something in such a forceful way, I'm getting a very strong reaction, that means they're putting up barriers, or I'm not allowing for their, in a sense, vulnerability in things. I'm not acknowledging that it can be quite difficult for them to deal with some of the ideas that are being presented. So, but fortunately it's not an experience I've ever had. I've obviously come across people who are quite resistant, but actually in time they're often the people who are the strongest advocates, because they've gone through that process of thinking, no, this is rubbish, I'm not going there with that. And then they've come through it and started to see perhaps a little bit more about it. I think the number one challenge in any kind of immediate conflict situation is to try to remain what I would call mindful, to be able to think, okay, I don't like this, but I'm going to try to listen to what this person's saying. I'm going to try to watch how I'm feeling about this and what I want to do and whether it's actually going to work for me. When we feel particularly challenged in a conflict situation, it's almost like we're going to rush to respond. Whereas I think sometimes literally taking 10 seconds to stop and listen, what's this person saying? How am I feeling about this? What do I want to do? Is that going to work for me or is that going to make it worse? If it's possible to do that, then that I would say is the number one thing. But at the same time, also to forgive ourselves if we haven't been able to do that, to accept, we just cracked back one way or another. We either ran out the room or we ran towards the person and either metaphorically or actually, and kind of, really attack the person one way or another. And if we did that, then we've got to stop and think afterwards, okay, next time, what could I do differently? What can I do about the fact that I did respond that way? Because it's never irretrievable, but the more we can actually stop and think rather than always react, I think the more effective we are in dealing with a conflict situation.